Hey class, welcome to week 2. Hope you've had a good week so far. Another discussion board this week. Okay, so we're going to be taking a look at agenda setting. I know that Seitel mentions agenda setting a bit in the book, but take a little bit of time and do a little bit of research on your run on this. You'll want to look at McCombs and Shaw. They're the original, one of the original disseminators of agenda setting. Won't take a ton of research on your part. It's very, very common theory. And we're not looking to do a real big deep dive here, but take a look at that, and it'll help with your discussion boards. Okay, so we're going to be talking about communication today. Communication, my goodness, it's like saying let's talk about the history of eating, right? I mean, where do you start? Okay, it is so broad. We're going to look at it again through the lens of public relations. Public relations is big, right? It's huge. But at the end of the day, it falls on the individual. Okay, it's like snow falling. It falls on everyone. It starts out as this giant thing in the sky, but by the time it ends, it affects each one of us individually. So that's kind of how I look at communication through public relations, right? Even though it's a giant, big effort, we're reaching each one person individually. So that's kind of how we're going to look at this today. And I want to hone in specifically on the idea of listening and hearing. Okay, there's a big difference on this, and so we're going to get a little bit into that. So communication has goals, right? Effective communication has goals. Certainly through public relations it has goals. Our goal is to reach the end listener. There's 4 different ways that we can do it, right? We can inform, which is to educate. Informing is one of the easier modes of communication because it's usually not contentious. We're sharing information. Okay. We can persuade. Persuasive communication gets a little more difficult. Right? Persuasive communication is when we're asking someone to join us. If the audience is undecided or if the audience is uneducated on it, that's a little easier. If you're working persuasion to an audience that disagrees with you, or is informed on the subject and comes from a different perspective, it's more difficult, right? Motivate is another type of communication. Coaches, leaders, they motivate. Motivation is where you get into a lot of Aristotle's ideas of rhetoric, where you get into the pathos and the logos and the ethos, where we're working on people's emotions and we're using our own credibility to motivate people. And then finally, to build mutual understanding, which what I would argue is maybe a combination of these 3, where we are trying to get together and find out what we can agree on, and then expand on that. Okay, so those are goals of communication, and for all of these to be effective, we need to reach the individual, and we have to ensure that the individual is listening. There is a big difference between hearing and listening. Listening is the most important communication skill. Without listening, we don't understand. We hear, but we don't understand. It's like listening to someone who speaks a foreign language that you do not know. You hear it, but you don't listen to it because you don't comprehend it. Okay, that is the difference there. So again, listening is not hearing. Hearing can be unintentional. When I teach this concept in the classroom, I go back to one of the to Superman Returns, one of the older Superman movies, and there is a scene where he tells Lois, he said, "I hear everything," and there's a scene where it shows him he's floating over the earth, and suddenly you truly do hear everything. You hear radio signals, you hear television signals, you hear moms calling their kids to come in for dinner, you hear cars honking, you hear sirens. It's just a cacophony of noise. And he closes his eyes and suddenly silence. Because he's gone from hearing to listening, right? We all do this. Take a walk around your neighborhood and suddenly stop. And you will notice that you hear birds, that you hear cars, you hear the noise of your own feet, you hear yourself breathing, right? But what are you listening to? It's very different. So that is something that as a communicator you have to take into account. Okay. Listening includes responding, right? It's an interaction. And the response doesn't have to necessarily be verbal, okay? If you're walking down the street and you hear birds chirping. You're not talking back to the birds, but you have received that, and then your response is an understanding that you hear it. Okay, so sometimes it doesn't have to be an audio response, but it is an interaction. And I know going back to week 1, we also talked about interactions. Communication is an interaction, all right, of closing the loop. The listener chooses to hear messages and then accompanies them and chooses to hear messages, or you hear messages and you choose to listen to those messages, and then you decide what you're going to use as a response or what you're going to take in. All right. Receiving is the initial step in the listening process. Okay. And that leads to responses. So why does this matter? Well, like we said, with public relations, it matters because you're trying to reach your audience. But four things about it, okay? So the 4 fundamental language skills are reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Here's a couple stats for you to bring this home. Okay, formal schooling, the average student spends 50% of its time listening, okay? A typical manager in a day-to-day job, 60% of their day listening. In daily life, 80% of us in daily life are doing some form of listening, okay? It's really important. A lot of communications folks would tell you that we listen more than we communicate out, all right? So are we paying attention? What we want to do is we want to get to the point where when in public relations, when we're communicating, we want to get our recipients to the point where they're practicing active listening. Okay, active listening is exactly what we've been talking about, where you are you're purposely taking in what you're hearing, you're consuming it, you're understanding it, and then many times you're acting on it. Okay. The average listener understands and remembers about 50% of a conversation. Within 2 days, that drops to 25%. Overall listening accuracy hovers around 25%. That's an Alessandra study from 1995. That's pretty amazing. Okay. And it makes sense. I mean, I'm a fairly intelligent person, and when I listen, I still don't recall everything, right? That's how we're made. So it brings us into a couple different issues. One, selective attention. Determining when incoming messages we process, determining what we're going to process. Okay, the problem is this restricts us in learning new things. So we selectively determine what we're going to listen to, and we determine that based on what we like. That's normal, but think of the things you're missing out on because you are selectively disengaging from things. Okay, it is something that is an issue. And then, of course, selective interpretation. This is altering messages that we hear and take in to fit into our confirmed beliefs, right? So this could go from the extreme of reading something and completely misinterpreting it to make you feel better, to reading something and maybe tweaking some things to say, okay, well, what he really means is this. Okay, we all do this, right? The key is to try to do this as little as possible, because we can miss out on what's being said. Okay, quickly, there's 5 steps to an effective listening process. And again, the reason we're talking about this is because this helps us to tailor our message. When we are reaching out in a public relations realm, we want to know what will be effective in having our receiver listen and take in these messages, okay? So that's why we're going over these things. The first step in listening is receiving. At the receiving stage, listening is equivalent to hearing, okay? It is the way we obtain sounds. If we receive only part of the message, trying to listen is like trying to read a book with pages missing, okay? So receiving, whether you're hearing or listening, you receive. Okay, that's where they're together. Step 2 in this is understanding. To listen effectively, we must comprehend communication in the presenter's own terms. To understand, we need to be open-minded. Okay, this is where hearing and listening start to separate, because now we're taking in this information and we're going to an understanding phase. where we have to take it in and understand what is being relayed to us. Step 3 is the evaluation stage. We judge the merits of the message here. Okay? This includes deciding whether we should continue listening and the relevancy of the message. The evaluation phase is where we're like, okay, is this worth my time? Or am I going to tune out? Right? So this occurs even when you're active listening. When you're active listening, you get to that point now where you are going to make that decision. Are you going to move forward, or are you going to say, okay, I've had it, I'm done. This is where a lot of the selectiveness comes in. Because at this stage, you can either say, okay, I don't like what this person's saying. It doesn't make me feel good inside. Maybe it's counter to my beliefs, but I'm going to stick with it because I want to understand and learn. Or this doesn't make me feel good. I don't want to believe this is true, so I'm going to walk away. Okay. So the evaluation stage is where this occurs. Okay, and then step 4 is recalling. All right. Recalling encompasses remembering and using the information. This is short and long term, and relates to information often that we already know. Okay, so this is the skill of being able to recall, and some people are better than this than others. I have a friend of mine who has an incredible memory, not only short term but long term. I mean, just makes for a good student, right? But this is where we get to the recall process, and we just went over this data a little bit ago about recall process. For most people, is not that good. Okay. And then step 5 in this process is responding. This is the feedback. Okay, it is the verbal and nonverbal reaction to communication. Important to look at this feedback, right? So whether you're talking to an individual, right, on an interpersonal level, or even if you get into a bigger scheme of things in public relations, the feedback is important. So it is essential to go into this in public relations knowing how these work and what stages these are. And it helps encompass your message, depending on who your audience is, okay? So I know the book gets into the nuts and bolts of public relations, but I want, as far as communication is concerned, I want to get a little bit more into the idea of listening and the idea of hearing and the idea of interpersonal communication, because it's about getting your message effectively to people. And in public relations, it's heavily in persuasion. Some of it is educational, but a lot of it's persuasion, okay? So that's what we're looking at. Response and effective interpretation, or I'm sorry, the understanding and interpretation of these responses is pivotal. All right, just got to remember that. So why does this matter? Okay, how do we apply this? A lot of different ways we can apply it, but one area that I want to hit on is the concept of selective exposure. Selective exposure, as we talked about it earlier, is just this idea that we all have our perceived notions. We all have our comfort zones. We all have things that we believe, whether it's through how we were raised, whether it's through our faith, whether it's through our experiences. It makes us who we are. Selective exposure is this concept where we are only going to gravitate towards what's going to reinforce what we already believe. Everyone does this. And you'll hear me say that a lot. Everyone does this, right? Because communication is a human thing. And we all have our own idiosyncrasies, right? But communication is a human thing that's been studied. It's a lot of psychology. It's a lot of sociology. It's how people act. It's how people react. And we're pretty predictable. Over thousands of years, we've gotten to know ourselves pretty well. We're pretty predictable in how we react to things. And selective exposure is something that's common everywhere. It could be as simple as, your football team or your hockey team, baseball team loses a game, and you don't want to read about it the next day in the paper because it makes you sick to your stomach, right? Very simple example. More heavier examples are the problem that we run into with fake news right these days, and how there are groups of people that believe something because they want to believe it, even though the facts and the data say that this isn't so. They don't want to hear it. They won't look at it. They won't read it. They won't consume it. They won't listen to it because it is so contrary to what they want to believe inside. And that is a damaging thing. And you find it politically on both sides of the spectrum. Internationally, you find it within countries. Where passions run high, you have selective exposure. I mean, I can. Republicans do never want to hear the fact that maybe you need to raise taxes in some areas to pay for things, and the data could support that, and they're like, no, I don't want to hear it. Absolutely not. Right? Democrats, you may say, look, we have to reform Social Security and Medicare, or it's going to go bankrupt, whether you like it or not, and it's going to bankrupt the country. And here's the data. They don't want to hear it. No, absolutely not. No, we don't need to reform it. Okay, so you can find it on both sides. The problem is that with selective exposure, it shields us from accepting truth. If we are putting our emotions ahead of our facts, that is going to be damaging to the country. That's going to be damaging to anything we do. Because when we make decisions, our decisions, whether they're very small decisions or large decisions, need to be based on facts and data and rationale. Right? That's how we live our lives. In a larger scope in public policy, if we have large swaths of people who fall under the selective exposure umbrella, they are putting their emotions ahead of truth. And that is going to hurt not only the country, but it's going to hurt our society. And that is something to look at in public relations. Because if you work for a public relations firm and you have a client who is trying to move a message forward that is contrary to a lot of emotional beliefs, even though the data may be with you, is a challenge. It's very difficult to get people to think differently because we are emotional people. We are comprised of our experiences. And when the data is contrary to that, we don't like it. So keep an eye on this. It's an interesting phenomenon, but it's also a very unfortunate one. Social media has expanded the platform for selective exposure. The concept's been around forever, but now that social media has expanded the tools that we get information out on, it has enabled it. Okay, so just something to think about. All right, well, great. I hope everyone has a good week. Please let me know if you have any questions, and we'll talk soon.